A reading from the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus said, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall." Now when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as their scribes. Jesus has been hard at it for quite a while. The words that I just read come from the very end of what we call the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6 and 7 of Matthew's Gospel. Beginning with the Beatitudes, we get in this extraordinary passage of teaching, we get so many insights and guides to leading a full, abundant Christian, as we would say, life. This is Jesus giving us so many indications of how to live out the good news. And his last word on the subject, his last word is about making sure your house is built on the rock and not on sand. The wise and the foolish man, the floods come, the rains come, and the rock lasts, but the house that is built on the sand does not. And, says Jesus, great was its fall. Well, that can sound quite daunting, but we should put it in context. We should remember a little bit more about who Jesus is speaking to. He's speaking to a great crowd, but principally among the crowd are his disciples. And perhaps principally amongst his disciples is a man who used to be known to his friends as Simon. Someone that Jesus looked at, summoned to follow him, and in whom Jesus clearly saw great potential, but rather surprisingly so. Simon was part of a family who had a very successful fishing business in a pretty rural backwater. He wasn't necessarily somebody that you might call on to become a fearless, great preacher and leader, which is, of course, what happens to Simon Peter, who gets renamed by Jesus, renamed as Peter, the rock on whom the church will be built. But of course, Simon Peter was not a perfect rock, at least not how we might imagine that phrase to be used. My word, Simon Peter had his faults. He was hot-headed, prone to anger, and could get it wrong spectacularly, and be an absolute coward who, as you know, betrays Jesus at kind of the crunch point in the whole gospel narrative. And yet, says Jesus, you are rocky. You are going to be the rock of the whole church of God. There's a clue there to us. It might be the clue that God calls us not despite our weaknesses, but because of them. God can use all of us, the strong and enthusiastic parts and the weak parts, provided we turn our full selves over to the love of God and the mission of God. God will do amazing things. So as we journey through Advent, as we look again at the Advent hope and promise that Christ will return as judge, let's not be too dismayed about those parts of our character that we think are the weaker parts or the less able parts, God can and will use them. God calls us to build our house on a rock. God calls us to be rock-like, and God will help us deliver. Amen.